I remember the exact moment I decided not to quit. It wasn't dramatic. I wasn't standing at a window overlooking Manhattan with a glass of wine, rehearsing some speech I'd never actually give. I was sitting in a bathroom stall on the 14th floor of the Callaway Group's Midtown headquarters, clutching an envelope I had sealed the night before, and I was reading a text message from my mother that said, "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you." I sat there for a long time. Then I folded that envelope and tucked it into the inside pocket of my blazer, right over my heart. Not because I'd changed my mind. I just needed to pick my moment. My name is Sloane Mercer, and for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, I worked as a senior financial analyst at the Callaway Group, a mid-size asset management firm operating out of a glass tower on 53rd and 6th. I know the timeline that precisely because I counted it, not out of sentimentality, but because every single one of those days cost me something. Time I can't get back. Sleep I never caught up on. Credit I handed to other people with a smile on my face, while my own career sat in a waiting room that never called my number. The Callaway Group occupied floors 12 through 16 of a building called Meridian Tower. Not the flashiest name, not the flashiest building, but the kind of address that made people at dinner parties nod with a particular kind of respect. Floor 14 was where the analysts lived. Long open floor plan, low-slung cubicles, fluorescent lighting that hummed just barely loud enough to make you wonder if you were imagining it, and windows that looked directly into the glass wall of another building approximately 40 feet away. Floor 16 was executive territory. You needed a separate badge clearance to get up there, and most of us never used it. I used it exactly twice in 2 years. Both times I was carrying documents for someone else. I want to tell you about a man named Preston Holt. Preston was the director of strategic partnerships, which was a title that sounded important and functioned mainly as a permission slip to take long lunches and attach his name to other people's work. He was 41, wore the same 3 blazers in rotation, and had a handshake that lasted slightly too long. He was also my direct supervisor, and he had spent the better part of 2 years finding sophisticated ways to make himself look essential while making me invisible. It started small, the way these things always do. He'd present my analysis in meetings without mentioning my name. He'd forward my reports to leadership with his own cover note, reframing the findings as though he'd originated the thinking. He once submitted a 40-page market evaluation I had worked on for 3 weeks and told the partners it was a collaborative effort he'd personally overseen. Collaborative. As in, he'd sent me a 2-line email in week 1 saying, "Pull the Q3 data and see what's there." That was the collaboration. I documented everything. I kept a folder on my personal laptop, not the company machine, labeled simply record. Every email, every meeting summary, I wrote up myself, time-stamped. Every instance where I could trace a decision back to analysis I had produced. I'm not sure when I started doing it. Somewhere in month 4, when I sent Preston a draft of a competitive landscape report and 3 days later heard him present its conclusions in an all-hands meeting and realized with a slow, sinking clarity that I had not been introduced, that my name had not appeared on the slide, that I was sitting in the 3rd row watching someone wear my work like a suit. I started keeping records that same evening. The person who actually saw me, at first the only person, was a woman named Octavia Drummond. Octavia was a senior partner, one of 2 women at the partner level in the entire firm, and she operated with the kind of quiet precision that made you want to work harder just by being in the same room. She had recruited me out of business school with a phone call that lasted 45 minutes, during which she asked me 3 questions and spent the rest of the time listening to my answers with what felt like genuine attention. I had taken the job partly because of that phone call. I had assumed Octavia would be my advocate, my mentor, the person who would open doors. What I hadn't understood was that Octavia was also navigating her own constraints in a firm where 2 of the 5 partners were openly dismissive of her judgment and the other 2 were politely indifferent. She was powerful, and she was limited in ways I hadn't been sophisticated enough to see when I was 26 and new and full of ideas. By the time I understood her position clearly, I had also learned to be patient in ways I had not been before. Not passive. Patient. The Vandermeer deal was the kind of thing that comes along once in a career at a firm like the Callaway Group. Hendrik Vandermeer was a Dutch private equity investor with a network that stretched from Amsterdam to Singapore, and he was in the process of allocating a significant portion of his family office's assets into American fund partnerships. The numbers circulating internally put his investment at somewhere between $80 and $110 million. The partners were practically vibrating. There had been 3 all-hands meetings in a single month, which at a firm that typically held 1 all-hands per quarter was the institutional equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. Preston had attached himself to the Vandermeer opportunity like a barnacle to a hull. He was not, in any formal capacity, leading the analysis. That responsibility had been assigned, quietly, to me. Octavia had brought me into it with a brief, careful conversation in her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She said, "Sloane, I want you to lead the quantitative modeling for the Vandermeer pitch. You'll need the full risk-adjusted return framework, scenario analysis across 3 market conditions, and a comparative positioning document. This is important work." She paused and then added, with an inflection I did not fully understand until later, "Make sure your name is on every document you produce." I went home that night and didn't sleep much. I worked instead. Over the following 6 weeks, I built the most comprehensive investment analysis of my career. I modeled 17 different portfolio scenarios. I ran stress tests against 4 distinct market disruption frameworks. I produced a 112-page document that I was genuinely proud of, not in an arrogant way, but in the way you feel proud when you have done something difficult exactly as well as you are capable of doing it. Every page carried my name in the footer. Sloane Mercer, Senior Financial Analyst. I had listened to Octavia. Preston, in the meantime, was doing what Preston did. He was scheduling calls with Hendrik Vandermeer's team. He was attending the preparatory meetings and speaking with the authority of someone who had spent 6 weeks building models, rather than someone who had spent 6 weeks forwarding my emails with his own commentary appended. In the meeting where the first draft of the analysis was presented to the partners, Preston said, and I am recalling this with a precision that I earned, "My team has put together something I think you'll find genuinely impressive." My team. Not Sloane. Not the analyst who had been at her desk until midnight on a Tuesday because the scenario modeling kept surfacing a variable she wanted to run down before she let it go. I said nothing. I sat in my chair, and I smiled the precise amount that the situation required, and I kept my hands flat on the table, and I thought about my folder. The resignation letter had been drafted 2 weeks earlier. I had written it on a Saturday morning at my kitchen table in my apartment on the Upper West Side, with a cup of coffee that went cold before I finished, because I kept stopping to think. It was a professional, measured letter. It cited no grievances. It thanked the firm for the opportunities one had been given and expressed my intention to transition my responsibilities carefully and completely. I had written it because I needed to know that I could leave, that I had a door and a key to it, and that the decision was mine. Once I had written it, sealed it, and put it in my bag, I felt something settle in me, a stillness that I hadn't had in months. I was no longer staying because I had no choice. I was staying because I hadn't yet decided to go. The date of the formal Vandermeer pitch was a Thursday in November. Hendrik Vandermeer himself was flying in from Amsterdam, and there would be a 2-hour presentation in the 16th floor conference suite, the one with the actual views, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Midtown, followed by a private dinner with the partners. Analysts were not typically included in the dinner. We were there to support the presentation and then disappear. I had been told, through Preston, that I should be available to answer technical questions if called upon. I prepared for that meeting the way I imagine athletes prepare for competitions. I reviewed every figure in my analysis until I could have reconstructed it from memory. I knew every assumption underlying every model. I knew the 3 places where a sophisticated investor might push back, and I had prepared responses that were direct, honest, and grounded in the work. I also knew, without anyone having said it explicitly, that Preston intended to walk into that room and present my analysis as though he had produced it. What I did not know was what was about to happen 2 days before the pitch. It was a Tuesday evening around 7, and the floor was mostly empty, a few people still at their desks, the cleaning crew working at the far end. I was in the small secondary conference room on 14, reviewing slides, when I heard Preston on his phone in the hallway just outside the frosted glass door. He wasn't being loud, but the building at that hour was quiet enough that his voice carried. He was talking to someone, and he was saying in the casual, confiding tone of a man who believed himself completely unobserved that the Vandermeer analysis had taken him and a few of the quant guys most of the fall to put together. He said had personally run the scenario frameworks. He said he was proud of what the team had produced under his leadership. I sat very still. Then I took out my phone and opened the voice memo app. I set it face down on the table with the screen off, and I listened. He talked for another 4 minutes. He said enough. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I want to be clear about that because what happened next might suggest otherwise. I am a precise person. I am a person who keeps records and thinks carefully and waits for the right conditions. I am a person who, when she has been patient for 2 years and 3 months and 11 days, knows exactly what to do with the moment when it finally arrives. The morning of the pitch, I arrived at Meridian Tower at 7:15. The building lobby was still half empty, just the security desk and a few early arrivals clicking through the turnstiles. I took the elevator to 14, set down my bag, and sent a single email. The recipient was Octavia Drummond. The subject line was, Vandermeer Analysis, Authorship Documentation. The body of the email contained a brief, factual paragraph noting that the attached materials represented the complete analytical work product I had personally produced over the preceding 6 weeks, that every document was timestamped and version controlled in the internal system under my credentials, and that I wanted to ensure the record was clear ahead of the day's presentation. I attached the full document archive, the internal version history report I had pulled, and a summary sheet I had prepared listing every document, its creation date, and my authorship. I was not accusatory. I was not emotional. I was a woman who had been keeping a folder. I then went to the bathroom on 14, the one with the slightly faulty light fixture that buzzed when it first came on, and I stood at the sink and looked at myself for a long moment. I thought about my resignation letter. I took it out of my bag, where it had been sitting for 2 weeks, and I held it. I thought about every late night, and every meeting where my name had been absent, and every small erasure I had swallowed professionally, and without complaint. And then I put back in my bag. Not yet. The 16th floor conference suite had been set up with the kind of care that signaled this was not a routine meeting. Someone had brought in actual flowers. There were printed materials in leather-bound folders at each seat. The partners had all arrived early, which never happened. Hendrik Vandermeer and 2 members of his investment team were shown in at 10 o'clock precisely. He was a tall, unhurried man in his mid-60s with a quiet authority that I recognized immediately as the genuine article rather than its performance. He had the look of someone who had seen many pitches and was not easily impressed. Preston opened the presentation. He stood at the front of the room with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed and who believed the room was his. He introduced the firm, introduced the partners, gave a brief overview of what the next 2 hours would cover. Then he began presenting the analysis. He was 3 slides in when Hendrik Vandermeer raised a hand. It was a small gesture, unhurried, and it stopped the room the way a sound stops a room. Preston paused. Vandermeer said, in accented English that was nonetheless entirely precise, "Before we continue, I received materials this morning from your firm. A document archive and authorship summary. Sent by someone named Sloane Mercer. I'd like to understand the team structure here. Who actually built this analysis?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. I know because I counted them. I was seated at the far end of the room, in one of the support chairs along the wall, not at the main table, and I felt every person in that room recalibrate. I saw Preston's jaw tighten in a way that I don't think anyone else caught because they were all looking at Vandermeer. Octavia, seated at the main table, turned to look at me. Her expression was neutral in the way that very controlled people are neutral when something significant is happening that they had suspected was coming. One of the other partners, a man named Clifford Rauch, who I had spoken to perhaps twice in 2 years, said carefully, "Sloane is our senior analyst on this engagement. She led the quantitative modeling." He said it as though this were already known, which of course for him it wasn't, but he was a man who understood the room and knew which way the air was moving. Vandermeer said, "Could she take me through the risk-adjusted return framework? I have some questions about the assumptions." Preston did not speak. I watched him not speak, and in that silence I stood up. picked up the small portfolio I had brought with me, walked to the front of the room, and spent the next 40 minutes answering every question Hendrik Vandermeer had about my analysis. I knew every number. I knew every assumption. When he pushed on the third scenario stress test, I walked him through the underlying methodology in a level of detail that I could see, in his expression, was not what he had expected to find in a firm of this size. When he asked about a specific sensitivity variable I had chosen to model, I was able to tell him not just what it was, but why I had included it, and what it would look like if market conditions shifted in the two directions he was most likely worried about. He asked good questions. I gave him honest answers, including twice acknowledging the limits of the model and where judgment calls had been made and why. He seemed to appreciate that more than anything. At the end of my portion, he looked at me for a moment and then said, "You built this yourself?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All of it?" I said, "All of it." He nodded once, slowly, in the way that people nod when they have learned something they consider important. Then he turned back to the room and said he'd like to continue. The rest of the pitch went well. I stayed at the front of the room. No one asked me to sit back down. Preston stood to the side and occasionally advanced the slides. I am told the dinner that evening went well. I wasn't there. Analysts don't go to dinner. I went back down to 14, sat at my desk, and ate the sandwich ID brought from home because I had, characteristically, anticipated a long day. Around 9:30, my phone lit up with a message from Octavia. It said, "Can you come up to 16 for a moment?" The 16th floor at 9:30 at night is a particular kind of quiet, the good furniture and the good views and the low lighting and no one in the outer offices. Octavia was in the main conference room with Clifford Rauch and a third partner named Delia Forsyth, who ran operations and was the most direct of the three. There was still wine on the table from dinner, and the leather folders were still out, slightly rearranged. Octavia said, "Vandermeer's team called after dinner. He's moving forward. He's committing $102 million. Delia said, "He also specifically requested that you be the primary analytical contact for the account." I sat with that for a moment. Clifford said, without quite looking at me, "We should talk about your role here, and about some things we probably should have addressed sooner." I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. I set the envelope on the table. Then I said, "Before we do that, I want to put this here so you know it exists. It's a resignation letter. I wrote it 2 weeks ago. I haven't decided whether to give it to you." I looked at all three of them. "That's going to depend on what happens in the next 20 minutes. Octavia looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she looked at me. And for the first time since I had known her, something in her expression that had always been carefully managed came slightly loose. Not into something weak, but into something that looked a little like relief, or recognition, or maybe just respect in its plainest form. She said, "Tell us what you need." I had a list. I want to be honest about what I asked for because it would be easy to make this story into something cleaner than it was. I didn't ask them to fire Preston that night. I didn't deliver ultimatums. What I asked for was documented. A formal title change to Associate Director of Research, which reflected what I had actually been doing for the better part of a year. A salary adjustment to the number I had researched and written down and knew was fair. A direct reporting line to Octavia rather than Preston, and a clear, written protocol for authorship and attribution on all work product going forward. I put all of this in a single-page document that I had prepared and carried in the same portfolio as everything else, because I had done this work, as I do all work, ahead of time. Clifford raised his eyebrows at the single-page document. Delia laughed once, briefly, in a way that wasn't unkind. Octavia said, "Give us 2 days." They gave me everything on the list. The title change and the salary adjustment were formalized within the week. The reporting structure was updated in the system the same day. Preston was quietly reassigned to a different division 4 weeks later. Not fired, not publicly humiliated, just moved laterally in a way that removed him from my sphere entirely, and that I suspect he understood, in whatever private accounting he kept of such things, was a consequence rather than a coincidence. I stayed at the Callaway Group for another 2 years after that. I managed the Vandermeer account for its full initial term. Hendrik Vandermeer renewed and brought a secondary allocation that pushed the relationship past 150. He sent a bottle of Bordeaux to the office at the end of year 1 with a handwritten card that said, in his precise English, "To the analyst who knew her numbers." I have the card somewhere. I kept it. The resignation letter I burned in the kitchen sink of my apartment on a Wednesday night in January, standing there in my pajamas at 11 p.m. while a glass of wine sat on the counter. I watched it go, and I didn't feel sad or triumphant or particularly anything. I felt done with it in the way you feel done with something that has served its purpose and no longer needs to be carried. I had held it at exactly the right moment. And then I had put it away, and I had done the work, and I had waited for a man who asked good questions and cared about honest answers. The building is still there on 53rd and 6th. I walk past it sometimes. I don't miss the fluorescent lights on 14, or the window that looked into another building, or the hum that might or might not have been in my head. But I think about that conference room on 16 sometimes, the flowers someone had brought in, the leather folders, the view of the city at night, and Hendrik Vandermeer asking me, in a room full of people who had spent 2 years not saying my name, to explain my own work. I said yes. I walked to the front of the room, and I knew every single number. That's the thing about doing the work. It's yours in a way that can't be transferred, no matter how many times someone puts their name on the cover page. They can borrow it, but they cannot own it. And when a man who has seen every kind of pitch and every kind of pretension sits across a table and asks who actually built this, the answer is the one thing in the room that cannot be managed or reframed or filed under collaborative effort. I built it. All of it. And the building, the room, the $102 million, all of it remembered who I was, even when the people around me had worked very hard to forget.